So let's turn to something that you've discovered that's taken your fancy over the last week. It's pretty scary. It's something called Dead Hand. What was Dead Hand?
Well, it was a doomsday device. Do you remember that fine Kubrick movie called Dr. Strangelove?
Of course.
Yes. Now, we should do a little bit of a recap on what the Cold War was for those in the audience who are not familiar with it. How would you describe it, Rod?
Well,
The Cold War.
It was a standoff between Russia and the United States, wasn't it? When they were both building up nuclear arsenals, and they were concerned about the European battleground and whether or not Russia was going to make a rush for Paris again,
and in fact, on the other side. Yeah, and on the other side, while to the Western press we were convinced that it was the Russians who were the aggressors and wanted to go through the the little gap in Germany and then push their way to Paris and London and Wollongong or wherever. On the other hand, if you read the journal Air and Space, put out by the American Smithsonian Institution, there are all these stories written by people who were American pilots and who, with the blessing of the American government during the Cold War, actually flew American planes inside Russian border and back out again, trying to stimulate the radar into action so they could see what the radar frequencies were. Imagine the uproar if Russian planes had flown over American continental land masses during that same period. Anyhow, there was lots of hype going on, and they had a thing called the mutually assured destruction, which was basically, if you put one nuclear weapon on me, I will put all of my 30,000 nuclear weapons on you and the rest of the world and wipe out the world.
Yeah,
and this MAD or...
Yeah. And that became nuclear deterrence, didn't it? That was the point of nuclear deterrence. But you're talking about something in specific that the Russians actually had, or the Soviets had,
which they had and have, a thing called Dead Hand or Perimeter, and it was a doomsday device. In other words, as put out in the movie Dr. Strangelove, a device that, once activated, would by itself set off a nuclear response, regardless of what the leaders of the country did. So it wouldn't matter if the US blew out the Kremlin, took out the defense ministry, etc., 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 something would respond. And this is based on an article in Wired, 2009, October, page 82. And basically, not only did the Russians build a dead hand, an automatic response system, they didn't tell the Americans about it, and it's only coming out now. And it had several parts where it would lie semi-dormant until there was some sort of crisis going on, and then it would monitor the seismic sensors and radiation and air pressure sensors for any sign of any nuclear bomb going off. And then going down a pathway, it would lead to the missiles being fired, special so-called command nuclear missiles that, besides heading off to the United States and the rest of the world to drop nuclear weapons on them, would also radio down coded orders to whatever Soviet missiles had managed to survive and tell them to go off as well. And it was slightly different from the American concept of a doomsday machine. The concept there was that it was to stop over-eager or over-anxious Soviet military or civilian leaders from launching prematurely. So if there were a bunch of goose flying into a radar beam, if the moon rose suddenly and looked awfully big, if there was a false sense of saying, hey, we could be under nuclear attack, it was designed to say to the Russians, look, don't worry, because this thing will go off automatically. If you all get killed, it doesn't matter, because you will still have your sacred revenge upon the US, because this nuclear deterrent, perimeter or dead hand will go off by itself. And according to this article, it is still active today in 2010.
Yeah.
Now, that's a bit of a worry.
It's a bit worrying, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. At the moment, we're way down on our nuclear weapons. The peaks were about 33,000 for the US in 1960, and about 20 years later, or 30 years later in 1990, this USSR got about 39,000. We're down to about 10,000 each side, something like that. Even so, one nuclear weapon by itself in a city would create more burns victims than all of the burns beds in the whole world could possibly accommodate. So, that's a nice cheerful way to start up the show.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Well, look, let's...